Michael Carter had always prided himself on running Skywings Airlines with a visionary mind and an uncompromising commitment to excellence. From his penthouse office in a luxurious building in Manhattan, he received glowing reports from his executives. Profits were rising, passenger numbers were steady, and customer satisfaction scores remained high. His airline was a symbol of reliability in the industry, a market leader. But why were there so many negative reviews flooding social media? Why were passengers describing his airline as a nightmare with delayed flights, poor service, and exhausted crews? More importantly, why was he hearing whispers, anonymous reports from within about overworked employees, unsafe schedules, and plummeting morale? Something was wrong, and he couldn't rely on polished reports or scripted boardroom presentations anymore. So, for the first time in over a decade, Michael Carter decided to board one of his own planes, not as the CEO but as David Miller, an ordinary businessman in cheap jeans, a hoodie, and a fake beard. LAX Airport, a rude awakening. Skywings' first-class lounge at Los Angeles International Airport was nothing like Michael had expected. The leather seats were worn, the self-service coffee machine was out of order, and the attendant behind the counter looked like she was one rude customer away from walking out mid-shift. He approached the counter, expecting the kind of VIP treatment he envisioned for his airline's most valued customers. "Excuse me," he said, keeping his voice neutral, trying to maintain composure. "I was wondering if there's an update on the flight to Chicago." The woman behind the counter barely glanced at him. "The flight's delayed another 45 minutes, Michael frowned. "Is there a specific reason?" Her tone was flat, disinterested. "Not really sure," she replied, showing no interest. Michael bit his tongue. If he were here as CEO, she would be fired on the spot. Instead he nodded. "All right, thank you." She had already turned away. "What the hell is going on with my airline?" He felt the truth hit him when he was finally called to board the plane. At first he felt a slight sense of relief, but within 10 seconds that feeling vanished. The jet bridge was packed with economy passengers, and despite the priority boarding, people were still pushing, sighing, and blocking the aisle. An elderly woman with a cane struggled to move, while a young man in a Skywings uniform, one of his employees, stood there casually scrolling on his phone. Michael clenched his jaw. This was unacceptable. Finally, as he boarded the plane, he expected at least some warm reception from the crew. However, he was met with tired eyes and half-hearted smiles. "Welcome aboard," a flight attendant muttered flatly without even looking at him. Michael glanced at her name tag, Lisa Carter. Definitely not family, he thought. Lisa turned away before he could even respond. Michael made his way to seat 2A, barely having time to settle in before he noticed another issue. The first class was filthy, crumbs scattered on the seat next to him, used napkins still left in the tray table, and the windows smeared with fingerprints. He sighed. If this is first class, he couldn't even imagine what economy class would look like. A man across the aisle kept pressing the call button repeatedly. 1 minute passed, then 2, but still no response. Finally, Lisa returned, but instead of helping, she simply leaned over and turned off the call button without saying a word. Michael silently watched, stunned, as he realized how much customer service had deteriorated. He couldn't believe what he was hearing, and his heart tightened as the truth behind the complaints began to sink in. As the flight took off, his frustration shifted into a heavier feeling, but nothing prepared him for what would happen next. Seated just behind him, Lisa and another flight attendant, Sarah Mitchell, were speaking quietly, exhausted. Michael hadn't intended to eavesdrop, but when he heard his own name, he froze. Sarah scoffed, "The CEO of this airline? Do you think he even knows what we're going through? He spends all day sitting in his glass tower, making money while we break our backs." Lisa laughed, then said, "He doesn't know anything." Michael felt his stomach twist. Sarah continued in a lower voice, "Have you heard about Emily? She was overloaded with work, going non-stop with no breaks. She was exhausted. When she collapsed, who cared? They didn't do anything. Just covered it up like they always do." Michael gripped the armrest tightly. He couldn't understand, who was Emily and why was this happening? Lisa shook her head and went on, "And the sad part is, nothing will change. As long as the money keeps coming in, they don't care." Sarah sighed and added, "If I were CEO, I'd step onto one of these flights just once to see what it's really like, to see if he actually cares about this company." Lisa laughed. Michael felt as though he had been punched in the chest. It wasn't just that they hated the CEO or the leader, it was him. And someone had died because of the neglect, covered up. His throat went dry. He wanted to turn around and demand answers, but he knew now wasn't the time. Instead, he sat still, his heart pounding in his chest, his ears ringing as he listened to the harsh criticism from his own employees. He had come here to find the truth and now he had it. Everything would change. As the plane touched down at O'Hare International Airport, Michael Carter barely noticed his surroundings. His mind was reeling as his employees had just uncovered something horrific. A cover-up, a death, exhaustion so severe that it had killed one of them and he hadn't known any of it. Over the years he had trusted his executives to manage the operations, but now the truth was out. Sitting in the dirty first-class seat he realized the truth. They had failed, or worse, he had failed them. As the plane taxied to the gate, he forced himself to stay calm. There was no reason to act hastily, at least not until he had all the information. But once the seatbelt sign went off he would no longer pretend. The moment of truth had arrived. Michael's hands trembled as he watched the shock spread across Lisa's face. The realization hit her harder than any reprimand he could have given. As the passengers continued disembarking, the once lively hum of the cabin was now swallowed by a suffocating silence. Michael stood there, still and unwavering, his eyes fixed on Lisa and Sarah. Lisa tried to speak, her voice faltering. I didn't know. I never thought you. Her words stumbled over one another, struggling to make sense of the moment. Michael's gaze hardened, his tone cold and commanding. Don't apologize. I want you to tell me everything. Now. His voice was firm, authoritative, but it carried an undertone of pain, an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel until now. The room, though still full of passengers, seemed to have shrunk in that moment, and Lisa was left no choice but to confront the truth. Her hand shook as she tried to steady herself, glancing nervously at Sarah, who was frozen in place, staring at the floor. Sarah's breath quickened, and for a moment the silence felt endless. Finally Sarah spoke up, her voice trembling. We didn't think it would get this far. Emily was working double shifts, no one cared when she collapsed. We knew, but we didn't have the power to do anything. Her words hung in the air, laden with guilt. Michael's chest tightened, his mind racing as the pieces of the story began to fall into place. Emily had died because of the very system he had created, the very system he had trusted his executives to uphold. And they had failed her. Who covered it up? Michael asked, his voice low but edged with fury. He could already feel the weight of betrayal pressing down on him, but he needed to know who had chosen profit over human life. Richard, Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. He told us to keep quiet about it. To protect the company's image. Her words were like a knife to his heart. Michael's hand clenched into a fist, his knuckles turning white. The truth was ugly and it had taken him far too long to see it. He had built Skywings into a symbol of success, but at what cost? His own employees had paid with their health, their well-being, and now one of them had paid with their life. And he had been blind to it all. Without a word, Michael turned on his heel, walking toward the cockpit. The decision was already made. This couldn't go on. He couldn't let it go on. The betrayal was too great, the consequences too severe. He needed to act. In the end, it wasn't just about the company. It was about the people who made it what it was. People who had been crushed under the weight of corporate greed and apathy. And Michael knew that for him to restore Skywings, he had to restore the trust and dignity of the people who worked for it. The moment had arrived. Sarah looked frightened. Sir, I didn't mean to. What you meant was that you've said everything you think, Michael said coldly. And that's why I'm listening. Lisa turned away, her hands trembling. Michael stepped closer. Who is Emily? Their reactions were instant. Lisa winced, Sarah turned away, her body language radiating fear. Michael's heart pounded. I heard what you said. Emily collapsed from exhaustion. And she and someone else covered it up? Sarah's throat tightened and she hesitated. Sir, we're not supposed to talk about this. Michael's voice lowered. Who told you? Both of them remained silent. Michael sighed, his patience running out. Fine. If you won't tell me, I'll find out myself. He turned and quickly walked toward the cockpit. The next confrontation awaited. Captain Daniel Rhodes, a man in his 50s with graying hair, glanced up with a tired yet polite expression. Sir, he said, when were you going to tell me that one of my flight attendants had died? The cockpit fell silent. The first officer turned away and Captain Rhodes stiffened slightly. Michael stood still, his eyes filled with anger and deep disappointment. The captain's question struck him like a heavy blow. A part of Michael still couldn't believe that this had happened under his leadership, that someone had died and he had been completely unaware of it. Really? Michael asked, his voice tight but still cold. Who was she? And what happened? Captain Rhodes sighed, appearing so exhausted that he could no longer maintain his calm demeanor. Emily Rogers, he said, his voice hoarse. She was one of our best flight attendants. She worked for us until she collapsed from exhaustion. We tried to warn management about the unsafe schedules, but everything was ignored. After she collapsed, we reported it, but everything was covered up. We were told to stay silent. And we did. Michael felt like he'd been punched in the chest. He stood motionless for a moment, taking a deep breath. It was hard to believe. A death within his own company covered up. And he had known nothing about it. Michael turned sharply, his eyes burning with resolve. Enough, he said, his voice firm and unyielding. This company needs to change. And I will be the one to make it happen. He strode out of the cockpit with unwavering determination. No matter the resistance from executives or board members, he would not let this be buried any longer. The cost his company had paid for neglecting its employees was far too great. The truth would come to light, and more importantly, he would bring justice to Emily and to the countless others who had suffered in silence. Emily's death could not be brushed aside like this. Her actions, her sacrifice would not be erased. Michael Carter would rise not only to protect his airline, but to defend all those who had given so much to it. His mission had just begun. Mr. Carter, I think it's best we discuss this privately, Rhodes said, his voice hoarse. Michael took a deep breath, anger beginning to rise. Why? Because this is bad for your airline? Michael narrowed his eyes. Then who's going to answer to me about this? Rhodes hesitated before speaking. Legal told us not to speak about it. Michael clenched his fists. Legal? He said, his voice turning cold. She collapsed after a flight from Dallas to Boston. She had been scheduled for back-to-back shifts for nearly 48 hours. She was exhausted. We warned management that this was a safety hazard, but they ignored us. Michael felt like he had been punched in the stomach. He said nothing more and just continued listening. We reported it to them, but they ignored us. In the end, they covered it up and made it look like a personal health issue rather than a work-related one, Rhodes continued, his voice low and weary. Michael's heart twisted and his hands clenched into fists. They had buried everything and he, the CEO of this company, had no idea about the decision. He didn't say another word. He just turned around and walked away, the sounds of the airport fading into a dull, indistinct noise in his ears. He knew he had to act immediately. As soon as he stepped off the jet bridge, he pulled out his phone and dialed his executive assistant. Mr. Carter, Michael's assistant answered immediately. How's it going? Set up a meeting with the senior leadership team tonight, no excuses. There was a brief silence. Tonight, sir? Most of them? I don't care where they are, they'll be there, Michael interrupted. His assistant hesitated for a moment, then sighed. Understood. Michael hung up, his heart pounding in his chest. This was his company, his responsibility, and now everything was about to change. Michael Carter had never felt this kind of rage. Not when a competitor had poached one of his best executives, not when the company lost millions in a failed expansion project, not even when the airline slipped below Delta and United in rankings. But this time, everything was different. A woman had died under the supervision of his company, and his own people had covered it up. Now, standing in Skywing's headquarters in New York, Michael knew one thing for certain. Someone would have to answer for this. The meeting with the executives, the war was about to begin. Skywing's boardroom was sleek and soundproof, designed for discussions about millions of dollars in deals, not the death of an employee. But tonight, it would become a battlefield. Michael sat at the head of the long glass table, arms crossed, his gaze cold. Across from him sat the senior executives, the people he had trusted to run Skywings. Richard Holloway, the COO, was already sweating. Daniel Shaw, the general counsel, adjusted his tie but remained silent. Melissa Vaughn, the HR director, sat upright, her face unreadable. Michael allowed the silence to stretch, letting them feel the weight of the moment before he spoke. Emily Rogers. She worked herself to exhaustion on a Skywings flight, and you all covered it up. The muscles in Richard's jaw tightened. Michael, I don't. Michael interrupted sharply, his voice like a knife. Don't lie to me. Richard exhaled and leaned forward. Look, it's more complicated than that. Michael tilted his head. Really? Because from what I've heard, it sounds pretty simple. She was overworked, collapsed, and instead of taking responsibility, you buried it? Finally, Melissa spoke up. Michael, our legal team? Damn it. I don't care about legal. Michael cut her off. Silence hung in the room. Michael's gaze was as cold as ice. What I care about is why my executives didn't tell me the truth. Daniel Shaw sighed. Because, Michael, if we had spoken up, it would have destroyed us. Michael laughed bitterly. Destroyed us? Do you really think this cancer inside the company isn't already destroying us? Daniel hesitated. Emily Rogers was a person, she had a family, and she died working for me. And you're telling me the only reason I'm hearing about this now is because I disguised myself and got on a damn flight? Richard swallowed hard. Michael, listen. No, Richard, you listen to me, Michael said, his voice cold. I built this company from the ground up, and I won't let it turn into a soulless machine that grinds its own people to dust. Michael leaned forward, his hands pressing against the table. We're going public with this? The room exploded. Michael, you've lost your mind, Richard gasped. This will tank our stock. Melissa scowled. The lawsuits will bury us. Daniel added, Michael, you're making us all panic. Michael didn't care about their shouts or their panic. He spoke calmly, decisively. Good, because Sky Wings deserves this downfall. Because Emily Rogers deserves justice. And because my employees deserve to know that their CEO truly listens. Melissa shook her head, standing up. You're destroying everything. Fault? Michael merely stared at her, saying nothing. No, Melissa, I'm fixing it. He turned to Daniel. Draft a statement. I want absolute transparency, no deceit, no corporate tricks. Daniel hesitated. Michael, I think we should wait. Let's handle this internally first. Michael's patience ran out. So when will we do something? When a reporter finds out. When another employee collapses. When passengers start noticing how exhausted and lifeless our crews are. We have to face the truth, or the truth will bury us. Silence filled the room. Richard's face showed no emotion. If you do this, Michael, the board might force you to resign. Michael sighed softly and replied, let them try. The betrayal and the leak. That night, Michael barely slept. The next morning, he didn't have to wait for his press conference because the story had already been leaked. Someone in the meeting had gone straight to the press. Sky Wings was all over the news channels, business blogs, and every major headline. Sky Wings Airlines accused of covering up employee death. Former flight attendant's family demands justice. CEO Michael Carter under fire, will he resign? Michael stared at the screen, his anger boiling inside him. His own team had turned their backs on him, and now, instead of controlling the narrative, he was facing the biggest media nightmare of his career. He picked up his phone and dialed, prepare a press conference in 1 hour. No scripts. The assistant paused, her voice hesitant. Sir, are you sure about this? Michael clenched his jaw. I've never been more sure about anything in my life. Sky Wings headquarters had never felt as hostile as this. Michael Carter stood behind the heavy wooden podium, the company's blue and white logo prominently displayed behind him. The cameras flashed, microphones hissed. This wasn't just a press conference, it was an execution. Reporters crowded around, their faces filled with anticipation, eager for something catastrophic. They weren't here to find answers, they were here to witness his downfall. Michael tightened his tie, exhaled deeply, and stepped into the fire. The press conference, CEO under fire. He scanned the room full of reporters, cameras aimed at him like loaded guns. Good morning, Michael said, his voice steady. No one responded. A reporter from the Wall Street Journal fired the first question. Mr. Carter, did you personally order the cover-up of Emily Rogers' death? Michael clenched his jaw. No, I didn't know about it until 48 hours ago, and that is unacceptable. The flash storm went off, whispers echoing through the room. A reporter from CNN stepped forward, curiosity in his voice. If you didn't know, Mr. Carter, then who did? Michael's fingers gripped the podium tightly, and he knew exactly who was responsible. Richard Holloway, Melissa Vaughn, Daniel Shaw, the people he had trusted. He took a deep breath. The individuals responsible for covering up this information will be removed from their positions immediately. A wave of surprise and murmurs swept across the room. Richard, sitting nearby, stiffened, while Melissa crossed her arms, lips tightly pressed together. But Michael didn't stop. I will not protect anyone who values profit over human lives, and I will personally ensure that this company is rebuilt from the ground up, if necessary. The reporters immediately pounced. Does that mean you're stepping down, Mr. Carter? Michael's eyes darkened. No. A voice cut through the chaos, but the board might force you to step down. A tense atmosphere filled the room. Michael kept his gaze steady. They can try. The cameras flashed continuously like machine guns, and Michael had just declared war. The consequences of the war, the betrayal. When the press conference ended, Michael stepped off the stage, his heart pounding. Richard was already waiting for him. What the hell just happened? Richard hissed through gritted teeth, his face flushed with anger. Michael barely glanced at him. That's leadership, he said coldly. Melissa approached, her voice icy. You just put the entire executive team in a tough spot. Michael turned to face them, responding with complete calmness. No, Melissa. You harmed yourselves when you concealed the truth. Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice. Michael, listen to me. The board is unhappy with you. They think you're... Michael couldn't hold back any longer, his voice firm. I don't care what the board thinks. Richard scoffed. You should care because they're going to hold an emergency vote tonight. Michael paused, fists clenched. A vote? Melissa smirked. To remove you as CEO. A heavy silence filled the air, Michael's heart pounding in his chest. Richard crossed his arms, his eyes sharp. You really think you can get through this? Michael stared at them, then unexpectedly smiled. Watch me do it. Michael stormed into his office, slamming the door behind him. He immediately picked up the phone. Sarah Mitchell, he said as soon as the phone was answered. You need to be in New York tonight. Pause. Sir, why? Sarah asked. Michael exhaled. Because if the board wants to take me down, I'll make sure they hear from the people who truly matter. The boardroom at Skywing's headquarters had never felt this tense. Michael Carter sat at the head of the long glass table, his expression unreadable. Across from him sat 10 board members, sitting in heavy silence. 2106. Those in the meeting room looked uneasy, while others had a gleam of anticipation in their eyes, hoping to witness Michael's downfall. And at the center of it all stood Richard Holloway. Michael had seen this coming for years. Richard had always craved power, and now he was seizing the opportunity to lead a coup against him. Richard clasped his hands together, his expression calm. Michael, let's get to the point. Michael leaned back in his chair, unfazed. Go ahead. Richard coughed lightly, savoring the moment. The company is in crisis, public trust is declining, stock prices are unstable, and after your reckless press conference, the board has serious concerns about your leadership ability. 2106. Michael didn't say a word. Richard continued, a smirk forming on his face. We will proceed with a vote immediately. A long silence followed. Michael scanned the room, seeing some board members avoiding his gaze, while others were eagerly waiting, hoping he would crumble. Michael sighed and shook his head. You think this is about stock prices and PR? Richard sneered, isn't it? Michael leaned forward, his voice lowering. No, Richard. This is about leadership. Witnessing the unexpected. The door to the meeting room opened and everyone turned to look. Sarah Mitchell and Lisa Carter walked in. A murmur spread across the room. Richard furrowed his brow. What is this? Michael stood up, his presence commanding. This is what real leadership looks like. Sarah swallowed hard, then faced the board. She hesitated for a moment, then began to speak. I loved my job before, but Skywings took everything from me, from all of us. Lisa nodded in agreement. We worked ourselves to the bone, and when Emily Rogers truly collapsed, the company erased her as if she had never existed. A heavy silence filled the room. Sarah fixed her gaze directly on Richard. You think this company is in crisis because of a press conference? No, this company is in crisis because of you. Richard's lips tightened, but Michael allowed the weight of those words to hang in the air. Michael let the weight of the truth sink in, his gaze sharp as he looked at the board members. So, who do you really want leading this company? The vote began. Richard, his voice tense, said, let's vote one by one. The board members started casting their votes. Remove, remove, stay, remove. Michael's heart raced. Stay, stay, remove. 4 voted to remove, 3 to keep. The next member hesitated, then softly said, stay. 4 stayed, 4 removed. 2 votes left. The next person sighed, stay. 4 stayed, 5 removed. Michael's heart felt heavy, everything seemed to stop. Then a moment of silence and the final vote rang out. Michael stays. Michael exhaled with relief, but Richard could not hide his anger. Michael turned to him, his voice steady. Richard, you're fired. A year later, Skywings Airlines was no longer the same company. Working conditions had improved, schedules were safer, and employees felt respected. Passengers noticed the difference and the industry recognized the change. Michael Carter had almost lost everything, but instead he rebuilt it all. As he boarded a Skywings flight, this time as a passenger, a familiar voice greeted him. Welcome aboard, Mr. Carter. He looked up to see Sarah and Lisa, now in leadership roles. Michael smiled, and for the first time in years he felt proud of the airline he had built. And this time he wouldn't stop watching. He had learned that true leadership wasn't about power or titles, it was about doing what was right no matter the cost. As the Skywings plane soared smoothly through the fluffy white clouds, Michael looked out the window, feeling an unusual sense of peace. The landscape below had changed, but he knew that this journey wasn't just about flight paths or business goals. It was about a person learning from mistakes, from pain, and from tough decisions. For the first time in years, Michael truly understood the weight of responsibility, not as a CEO, but as a human being who had witnessed the transformation of a company and the people within it. Every decision, every sacrifice, every challenge had led him here. And as he sat in that seat, he realized that true leadership wasn't about maintaining control, it was about nurturing change, acknowledging flaws, and doing whatever it took to make things right. It was a lesson he had learned the hard way, and he was determined to never forget it. He recalled the early days when he first took the helm of Skywings. He had built the airline from scratch, driven by a desire to create a powerful, fast-growing business that would yield profits. But now, standing atop that pinnacle, he realized that what truly mattered was not the achievements or accolades. Real strength did not lie in the numbers on the report but in how he treated those who had been by his side throughout the long journey. And then, the image of Emily Rogers, the young woman who had silently passed away, resurfaced in his mind. She had sacrificed everything for the job, yet people like Emily were never truly acknowledged, never truly listened to until it was too late. But Emily's story became a powerful call, an unmissable lesson about respect and the rights of every worker. From these losses, Michael had found the true path for Skywings, a path where people were valued more than numbers, where compassion and fairness were prioritized above all else. Looking at Sarah and Lisa, who now held leadership roles in the company, Michael could feel the true transformation. They were no longer just former employees but individuals who had stood strong, capable of guiding others with heart, patience, and courage. They embodied everything he had learned throughout this journey, that sometimes the greatest strength lies in the ability to rise after falling, and that change doesn't come solely from one person's decisions, but from collective effort, working together to build a solid and fair foundation for everyone. We can't change the past, but we can create the future, Michael whispered to himself. This flight, much like the journey he had gone through, hadn't always been smooth, but in the end, the hardships and challenges had taught him that every crisis hides an opportunity to become a better person, to create an environment where everyone is heard, valued, and respected. Skywings was no longer the airline Michael had built before. It was no longer just a business but a community where every employee and every passenger felt valued, respected, and cared for. As he looked ahead, Michael knew this was just the beginning of a long journey ahead, a journey of change, of deeply rooted human values. This flight was not just a continuation of another flight, but the first step in a new journey, one where every decision would always put people first, and where compassion would be the beacon that illuminated the path Skywings would follow. Michael felt an immense sense of pride, not because he was the CEO, but because he knew he was leading a company that truly mattered.